They told us the ship had been reclaimed, sanctified, cleansed by rite and fire before we ever stepped aboard. I verified the seals myself, counted them 3 times, felt for the texture of forgery and found none. The bell rang during our first translation, and I watched the chain pull itself through the bulkhead without a hand upon it. I recorded compliance anyway because the numbers matched and the ink was issued and questions were not part of my function. The muster bell rang without a hand upon its chain, and I watched the rope pull itself taut through the shrine bulkhead grown warm and slick with condensation that had no source. My stylus was already moving across the tally slate before the second peal, recording compliance marks for the oath deck assembly as the deck plating flexed beneath boots that numbered 147 pairs, mine included. I had been a void scribe for 6 years prior to this reassignment, always attached to munitorum convoys where bells were rung by ratings whose names appeared on rosters I myself had copied. Here the bell rang, and the chain moved, and no name was attached to the motion. The cruiser was called the Enduring Testimony, reclaimed from traitor hands after a cleansing campaign I had not witnessed, but whose authentication seals I had verified during embarkation. The seals were correct. The parchment was aged appropriately. The wax bore the Munitorum's double eagle pressed deep enough to prove a genuine stamp. I had counted the seals 3 times while waiting in the embarkation hold, running my thumb across their ridges to feel for the texture of forgery, and found none. The ship was sanctioned. The voyage was listed. My reassignment had come with the proper authority codes, transferred from convoy duty to reclamation support, a lateral move that maintained my grade and extended my indenture by 2 years in exchange for hazard compensation I would never see, but which appeared correctly in the ledger I was required to maintain. The oath began without preamble, as the bell's 3rd ring faded into the bulkheads. I knew the Catechism of Translation by heart, had recited it at the moment of warp entry on 14 separate voyages, and I opened my mouth to join the massed voices in the first line. But the words that filled the oath deck were not quite the words I knew. The rhythm was correct. The cadence matched. The gestures of the assembled crew formed the sign of the Aquila through movements that approximated the proper hand shapes. Fingers spread and thumbs touching in a way that was close enough to orthodoxy that correction would seem pedantic. Yet the syllables themselves slipped sideways in my hearing, names invoked that I could not quite grasp, vowels that stretched longer than breath should allow. I recorded the marks anyway. My stylus moved across the slate in the pattern I had been trained to execute, 1 mark per crewman present, checked against the roster that had been issued that morning. The roster listed 147 souls for this assembly. I counted 147 figures standing in formation. The numbers matched. The oath continued, and I wrote, and the bell rang a 4th time without the chain being pulled by anything I could see. The deck plating was warm through the soles of my boots. Not hot, but warmer than it should have been in the moments before translation, when the ship's systems typically ran cold to conserve power for the Geller field generators. I shifted my weight and felt the metal flex slightly, a give that was wrong for Imperial decking, but not impossible for a vessel that had undergone extensive refit. The warmth spread up through my feet and into my shins, and I told myself it was simply the effect of 147 bodies packed into an enclosed space, heat rising from collective mass and breath. The oath reached its conclusion, the final syllables hanging in the air longer than they should, before dissipating into the ventilation system's constant hum. The assembled crew held the Aquila sign for 3 seconds, as was proper, and then lowered their hands. I recorded the completion mark and checked my chronometer to note the duration for the log. 17 minutes and 38 seconds, which was within acceptable variance for a standard translation catechism. The bell rang once more, and this time I watched the chain closely. It pulled itself hand over hand through the shrine bulkhead, links clanking against metal worn smooth by use, and I could see no mechanism that might explain the motion. Gravity assist, perhaps. A delayed pulley system triggered by the first ring. I wrote these possibilities in the margin of my slate. small annotations that helped me organize the world into explicable phenomena. The assembly dismissed in orderly ranks, crewmen filing toward their stations along routes marked by luminescent strips set into the deck. I remained on the oath deck to complete the post-assembly tally, checking that all 147 marks corresponded to 147 departing figures. The count held. I signed my name at the bottom of the slate and applied my personal seal, a small brass stamp issued to all void scribes of my grade, and felt the satisfaction of a task completed correctly. A rating approached from the forward passage, his uniform clean and his augmetic left arm bearing the proper maintenance sigils of a voidsman third class. He held out a data wafer and spoke in the clipped cadence of someone who had delivered the same message many times. "Scribe, your bunk assignment has been confirmed. Deck 7, Compartment 12, Berth 4. Your personal effects have been transferred. Report there within the hour to verify inventory." I took the wafer and inserted it into my slate, which absorbed the information with a soft chime of acceptance. Acknowledged. Is there a duty schedule attached? You'll receive it during first watch after translation completes. For now, remain available for recount should discrepancy arise. He turned without salute and disappeared back into the forward passage, his footsteps swallowed by the hum that filled every space aboard the enduring testimony. I gathered my slate and stylus case and made my way toward the aft stairwell that would take me down to Deck 7. The corridors were wide enough for 3 crewmen abreast, their walls lined with purity seals that fluttered in the ventilation's breeze. I counted them as I walked, a habit born from 6 years of tallying everything I encountered. 42 seals between the oath deck and the first junction. 37 between the junction and the stairwell. Each one inscribed with prayers I recognized from standard imperial litanies, their parchment yellowed appropriately, their wax seals intact. The ship had been cleansed. The ship was sanctioned. I repeated these facts to myself as I descended, my boots ringing against metal stairs that had been scrubbed clean of whatever corruption they had once carried. Deck 7 smelled of reclaimed air and machine oil, the scent sharp enough to make my eyes water until I adjusted. Compartment 12 was marked by a brass plate bolted beside a reinforced hatch, and I pressed my palm against the entry pad to register my authorization. The hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a narrow chamber containing 8 berths stacked in pairs, 4 to each side. My assigned berth was the 4th from the door, upper tier, already occupied by a small crate containing my personal effects. I climbed the ladder and verified the inventory against the list I kept memorized. 2 changes of uniform, 1 devotional text, 1 spare stylus case, 1 chronopiece, 1 ration tin containing 6 weeks of compressed nutrition bars, everything present, everything correct. I lay down on the thin mattress and stared at the underside of the ceiling, which was close enough that I could have reached up and touched it without extending my arm fully. The metal was painted the standard gray of imperial interiors, and I could see the slight discoloration where previous paint had been scraped away and reapplied. Cleansing procedures, sanctification rituals, evidence that someone had cared enough to restore this ship to proper function. I closed my eyes and listened to the ship's ambient sound, the constant hum of engines and air recyclers, and the deep thrumming vibration that came from the warp drive preparing for translation. The bell rang again, distant but clear, and I counted the peals. 5, 6, 7, 8. The translation was beginning. I felt the pressure change in my ears as the Geller field activated, reality folding around the ship like a membrane pulled tight. The warp was hostile, but it was ordered by faith. I whispered the first line of the traveler's hymn and felt my heartbeat slow to match its rhythm. Survival came from compliance. Compliance came from proper procedure. Procedure was what I knew. The ship lurched once, a sensation like falling sideways through thick air, and then settled into the smooth glide of warp travel. I opened my eyes and saw that the paint on the ceiling had changed color, now a shade darker than it had been moments before. I blinked and looked again. The paint was gray. The paint had always been gray. I was experiencing translation strain, the common disorientation that came from moving between real space and the immaterium. I would adjust within a few hours, as I always did. Someone entered the compartment below, their footsteps heavy enough to make my berth vibrate. I heard the sound of a crate being opened and the rustle of fabric as they sorted through belongings. Then, silence. I waited for them to speak, to acknowledge my presence, but no greeting came. After several minutes, I heard them climb into a lower berth and the creak of the mattress as they settled. The hum of the ship filled the space between us, and I realized I had not heard the hatch close after they entered. I leaned over the edge of my berth and looked down. The compartment was empty except for me. All 7 other berths were unoccupied, their mattresses bare. The crate I had heard being opened sat unopened beside the hatch, its lid still sealed. I pulled myself back up and stared at the ceiling again, my pulse elevated but controlled. Translation strain. Auditory hallucination. A common effect of warp exposure, documented extensively in medical texts I had once read while tallying inventory in a Medicae supply depot. The brain compensated for the absence of familiar sensory input by creating phantom sounds, phantom presences, phantom movements. It would pass. The bell rang 9 times, then 10, then continued ringing without pause for what might have been minutes or hours. I lost count after 15 and focused instead on my breathing, matching it to the rhythm of the engine hum beneath the bell's constant peal. Eventually, the ringing stopped, and the silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached up and touched the ceiling, needing to confirm that it was solid, and felt the metal vibrate faintly beneath my fingertips. Someone else entered the compartment, their footsteps deliberate and measured. This time I did not look. I heard them move to one of the lower berths, heard the creak of the frame as they climbed in, heard the rustle of fabric as they adjusted their position. Then breathing, slow and even, the sound of someone already asleep. I closed my eyes and counted my own breaths until sleep found me, and I dreamed of bells that rang in sequences I could almost recognize but never quite place. When I woke, the compartment was full. 7 other crewmen occupied the berths around me, their breathing synchronized in a way that should have been impossible. I lay still and listened to them breathe, in and out, a collective rhythm that reminded me of the translation oath's cadence. The chronometer strapped to my wrist showed that 6 hours had passed since translation. First watch would begin soon, and with it my official duty assignment. I climbed down from my berth carefully, trying not to disturb the others, and made my way to the compartment's small ablution alcove to wash. The water from the tap ran warm and tasted of iron and something else I could not name, metallic, but not unpleasant. I splashed it on my face and felt the translation strain begin to lift, my mind clearing as my body adjusted to the ship's rhythms. When I returned to the main compartment, all 7 berths were empty again, mattresses bare and undisturbed. I stopped in the center of the room and turned slowly, checking each berth in sequence. No one. No evidence that anyone had been there. The air still held the warmth of occupied space, but that proved nothing. The hatch opened before I reached it, and the same rating from yesterday stood in the passage holding a data wafer. Scribe, first watch duty assignment, report to the tally station on Deck 3, Junction 17. You will be issued materials upon arrival. I took the wafer and loaded it into my slate. Is there a duty rotation schedule, or will assignments be issued daily? Daily. He turned and walked away without further explanation, his augmetic arms swinging in perfect mechanical rhythm. I made my way up to Deck 3 using a different stairwell than the one I had descended yesterday, following the luminescent strips that marked the approved routes. Junction 17 was larger than I expected, a confluence of 5 corridors marked by a hexagonal chamber containing a waist-high lectern bolted to the deck. The lectern held a data terminal and a locked drawer, both bearing the seal of the Departamento Munitorum. A note had been affixed to the terminal screen with adhesive wax, my name written in careful script at the top. The note informed me that my primary duty would be maintaining living inventory for all crew assigned to transit operations. I was to record who reported for their shifts and who did not, cross-referencing against the master roster that would be updated each morning. Discrepancies were to be noted immediately and reported to the deck officer, whose name and location would be provided as needed. The note was signed with a seal I did not recognize, circular rather than the usual munitorum square. Its wax, a deep red that seemed to shift to purple when viewed from certain angles. I unlocked the drawer using the code provided in the note and found it stocked with fresh slates, stylus replacements, and a leather-bound ledger whose pages were already partially filled with entries dating back 3 weeks. I ran my finger down the columns and saw that the handwriting changed every few days, different scribes cycling through this posting. The most recent entries were dated 2 days before my embarkation. The scribe before me had noted that 15 crewmen failed to report for Gamma Watch, and that the discrepancy had been resolved through reassignment. No further details. I began my first tally at the start of First Watch, marking down each crewman who passed through Junction 17 on their way to assigned stations. The flow was steady, predictable. Faces I did not recognize, but uniforms I understood. Voidsmen, engine seers, ratings, servitors guided by their handlers. I recorded them all, checking their designation numbers against the roster that appeared on the terminal when I entered my authorization code. The numbers matched. The flow continued. After 2 hours, I had recorded 83 souls passing through Junction 17, and the terminal confirmed that all 83 were accounted for on the master roster. The bell rang once, clear and close despite no visible bell in Junction 17. I looked up from my slate and saw that the corridor traffic had stopped, every crewman frozen mid-step. Then they continued moving as if nothing had interrupted them, their stride unbroken, their conversations resuming without pause. I looked down at my slate and saw that my stylus had recorded an extra mark during the bell's ring, a mark I did not remember making. The count was now 84. I checked the roster. 83 names. I recounted the marks on my slate. 84. I erased the extra mark and continued recording. The discrepancy was minor, easily explained by hand tremor during the bell's unexpected ring. The flow continued. By the end of First Watch, I had tallied 192 souls through Junction 17, and the master roster confirmed 192 accounted positions. The numbers matched. I signed my name at the bottom of the slate, applied my seal, and transferred the data to the terminal for official record. A message appeared on the terminal screen as soon as the transfer completed. Report to Compartment 712 for mandatory rest period. Second watch assignment will be delivered at appropriate time. The message disappeared before I could read it twice, the screen returning to its standby state showing the ship's seal, which I now noticed was the same circular design as the seal on the note. Not quite the Munitorum standard, but close enough that I had not questioned it during embarkation verification. I returned to Deck 7 and found my compartment occupied by the same 7 crewmen I had seen that morning, all of them sleeping in synchronized breathing patterns. I climbed into my berth without disturbing them and lay down to rest, though sleep did not come easily. The ship's hum had changed pitch, now resonating at a frequency that made my bones ache. I pressed my palms flat against the mattress and felt the vibration travel through the metal frame and into my skeleton, a deep thrumming that matched the rhythm of the sleeping crewman's breath. When I woke, they were gone again, and a data wafer lay on my chest where someone had placed it while I slept. The wafer contained my second watch assignment, identical to the first, except that I would now be stationed at Junction 9 on Deck 5. I dressed and made my way there, following the luminescent strips through corridors that seemed narrower than they had been during my previous traversal. The walls pressed in slightly, or perhaps I was simply more aware of their proximity, my translation strain manifesting as spatial distortion. I walked faster and reached Junction 9 with time to spare before second watch began. The process repeated. I recorded crewmen as they passed. I checked them against the master roster. The numbers matched. The bell rang at irregular intervals, and each time it rang, I found that my stylus had added an extra mark without my conscious direction. Each time I erased the mark and continued. By the end of second watch, I had recorded 208 souls, and the master roster confirmed 208 accounted positions. I transferred the data and received another message instructing me to return to my compartment for rest. This pattern continued for 3 full cycles before the first true discrepancy emerged. On the 4th cycle, during Gamma Watch, I was stationed at Junction 22 on Deck 8 when I noticed that a voidsman passed through twice, once at the beginning of watch and once near the end, but his designation number had changed between appearances. Same face, same gait, same augmetic right eye, but the number stenciled on his uniform collar was different by a single digit. I checked the roster. Both numbers appeared, listed as separate individuals assigned to separate stations. I made a note in the margin of my slate and continued recording. At the end of Gamma Watch, when I transferred my data to the terminal, the note I had written was gone. I checked my slate carefully, running my stylus over the place where the annotation had been. The surface was smooth, unmarked, as if I had never written anything at all. The terminal displayed a new message. Discrepancy noted and resolved. Continue standard procedure. I wanted to ask someone about this, to find the deck officer whose name had never been provided, but first watch was beginning and my assignment wafer indicated I should report to Junction 4 on Deck 2. I went there and resumed recording, and the voidsman with 2 numbers did not appear again. When I returned to my compartment after first watch, I found that someone had left a small parcel on my berth, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. Inside was a replacement stylus case, newer than the one I had been issued, its brass fittings polished to a bright shine. No note accompanied it, no explanation. I added it to my personal effects and lay down to rest. The 7th cycle brought the first true absence. A rating who had appeared on the master roster for every previous watch failed to pass through my assigned junction during Delta Watch. I waited until the watch ended and confirmed that he had not appeared anywhere else in the system. His name was listed. His designation number was active, but he had not reported. I made a notation on my slate and transferred the data to the terminal, expecting correction or explanation. The message that appeared was brief. Absence recorded. Reassignment in progress. Adjust master roster accordingly. I accessed the roster and found that the rating's name had been moved to a different section, labeled Internal Postings. No station assignment, no watch schedule. Just his name and number, preserved but relocated. I completed the adjustment and signed my authorization, and the terminal chimed acceptance. When I checked the roster the next cycle, the name was gone entirely, scrubbed from even the internal postings section. I did not make a note of this. I had learned that notes disappeared. The pattern became clear over the following cycles. Crewmen who hesitated during the translation oath, who did not quite match the cadence, who formed the Aquila sign with slightly wrong hand positions, these crewmen eventually failed to report for their watches. Their names moved to internal postings, then disappeared. The master roster shrank in small increments, 5 names here, 3 names there, the total crew count declining while the ship continued to function without apparent disruption. I recorded these changes because recording was my function, and I told myself that this was normal crew attrition, the expected result of void service where accidents and illness and reassignments were constant realities. On the 14th cycle, a correction order arrived during my rest period, delivered by a rating I did not recognize. The order was printed on parchment bearing a seal I had never seen before, octagonal and pressed deep enough to leave an impression on the paper's reverse side. The wax was dark green, almost black, and warm to the touch despite having obviously been applied hours earlier. The order instructed me to amend the previous cycle's tallies to reflect a pre-approved total of 132 souls rather than the 129 I had recorded. I read the order 3 times, checking for error or clarification. None was provided. The order simply stated that the correct total was 132 and that I should adjust my records to match. A second sheet attached to the order listed the names and designation numbers of 3 crewmen who should be added to my previous tally, all of them assigned to stations I had not been monitoring during that watch. I sat on my berth with the order in my hands and felt the weight of what was being asked. I was being instructed to record souls I had not personally counted, to certify their presence based solely on administrative directive. This violated every principle of accurate tallying I had been taught, every standard of scribe duty I had maintained for 6 years. But the order bore a seal, and seals implied authority, and authority was meant to be obeyed. I amended the records. I added the 3 names. I transferred the corrected data to the terminal and signed my authorization. The terminal chimed acceptance, and a new message appeared. Accuracy appreciated. Proper function maintains proper order. I lay back on my berth and stared at the ceiling, which had darkened again to a shade closer to charcoal than gray. My wrist itched where the uniform cuff pressed against skin, and when I pulled back the fabric, I saw a small mark, circular and red, exactly where my wrist had rested against the lectern at Junction 4 while I recorded tallies. The mark was warm, not painful, and faded as I watched until only a faint discoloration remained. I pulled the cuff back down and told myself it was contact dermatitis, a common reaction to the chemical treatments used on standard Imperial furnishings. The 15th cycle brought my first summons to the Engineerium. The order arrived during Gamma Watch, interrupting my tallying at Junction 11 with a priority message that appeared directly on my slate without passing through the terminal. Scribe: deliver completed ledgers to Engineerium Deck, Section Primus, for ritual verification. Entry blessing required. Report immediately. I locked my current slate and gathered the physical ledger from my duty station's drawer, tucking it under my arm as I made my way toward the aft stairwells that descended to the Engineerium levels. The air grew warmer as I descended, and the hum that filled every space aboard the Enduring Testimony deepened to a resonance I could feel in my chest. The luminescent strips along the deck grew brighter, their light taking on a golden quality that was warmer than the standard blue-white of Imperial illumination systems. Section Primus was marked by a heavy blast door adorned with the gear and cog symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Though the symbol was rendered in a style I did not immediately recognize, its angles slightly softer than the rigid geometry I had seen on other vessels. A robed figure stood beside the door, face hidden by a hood, augmetic limbs emerging from beneath red fabric. The figure gestured to me without speaking, and I approached as instructed. "The ledger requires blessing before entry," the figure said, voice rendered mechanical by a Voxcaster implant. "You require blessing before entry. This is procedural necessity. Hold out your wrist." I extended my left wrist, the one bearing the faint mark from the lectern. The figure produced a device that looked like a standard blessing stylus, the kind used to mark purity seals and official documents, but its tip glowed with a light that was too warm, too organic, more like living tissue than sanctified metal. The figure pressed the tip against my wrist, and I felt heat bloom beneath my skin, spreading up my forearm and into my elbow. Not pain, exactly, but intense sensation that made my breath catch. "The mark permits passage," the figure said. "The mark permits function. Entry is granted." The blast door opened without being touched, its mechanism operating smoothly despite the door's obvious weight. Beyond lay the Engineerium proper, a vast chamber filled with machinery that seemed too responsive, too fluid in its movements. I had been in Engineeria before, had delivered documents to tech priests on 4 separate vessels, and I knew what sanctified engines should look like. They should be rigid, mechanical, their movements precise and predictable. These engines moved with something approaching grace, pistons sliding through their housings like limbs through water, gears meshing with a whisper rather than a clank. The heat was perfectly even, distributed through the space without the usual hotspots that clustered around plasma conduits and reactor housings. The tech adepts who tended the machinery moved in synchronized patterns, their chanting audible beneath the engine noise, but softer than standard Benharic cant, syllables flowing together in ways that suggested meaning beyond machine language. I approached the central altar platform, where a senior engineer stood reviewing data scrolls, his augmetic eyes clicking as they tracked across text. "Ledger," I said, holding out the bound volume. "Cycle 14 records, crew tallies, and compliance marks." The engineer took the ledger without looking at me and placed it on the altar beside an incense burner that produced smoke smelling of iron and something sweet, like fruit, left too long in warm air. He opened the ledger and ran his mechadendrite across the pages, the appendage's tip glowing faintly as it scanned my handwriting. After several minutes, he closed the ledger and marked its cover with a seal, identical to the octagonal seal I had seen on the correction order. "Records accepted," he said. "Accuracy maintained. Compliance noted. Your mark will ease further deliveries. Return to your station." I wanted to ask about the mark on my wrist, about the engines that moved too smoothly, about the chanting that sounded too much like gratitude and not enough like prayer. But questions were not part of my function. I took the ledger and turned to leave, and as I passed one of the massive engine housings, I saw a servitor turn its head to follow my movement. Its eyes replaced with lenses that had no right to show expression but somehow did anyway. I walked faster and did not look back. The mark on my wrist grew warmer as I ascended the stairwells, heat pulsing in rhythm with the ship's ambient hum. By the time I reached Junction 11 and resumed my tallying, the heat had faded to background sensation, something I only noticed when I thought about it directly. I completed Gamma Watch without incident and returned to my compartment, where I found all 7 berths occupied by sleeping crewmen who breathed in perfect unison. I did not sleep that cycle. I lay in my berth and listened to them breathe, counting the seconds between inhale and exhale, and found that their rhythm matched the cadence of the translation oath we had recited on the first day. In and out, syllables made flesh and converted to breath. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of engines that sang and servitors that watched, and bells that rang inside my ribs where sound should not be able to reach. The 20th cycle brought my first mandatory confession. The summons arrived during my rest period, a physical note rather than a data wafer, written in script so precise it looked printed. Scribe. Report to Crew Chapel. Deck 4 for record reconciliation and doctrinal review. Attendance mandatory. Failure to attend will result in notation. I had not been inside a chapel since embarkation verification, when I had attended a brief blessing ceremony meant to sanctify our journey. I made my way to Deck 4 and followed the signs toward the chapel entrance, marked by a doorway carved with imagery I almost recognized. Saints in robes that hung too long, halos that fractured into geometric patterns rather than simple circles. The aquila rendered with feathers that seemed to move in the corridor's air. Current, though the stone was obviously static. Inside, the chapel was larger than it should have been, its ceiling lost in shadow despite the lumen strips that lined the walls. Pews had been arranged in concentric circles rather than the standard linear rows, all of them facing a central altar that held a book I could not identify. A confessor stood beside the altar, his robes clean and his face weathered in a way that suggested age without specifying how much. He gestured for me to approach. "Scribe, you are here for reconciliation. Your records show minor discrepancies that require clarification. Please be seated." I sat in the first pew and set my slate on my lap, ready to reference whatever records he wanted to discuss. The confessor did not ask me to open the slate. Instead, he produced a ledger from beneath his robes. a twin to the one I had delivered to the engineerium, and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. "You recorded 129 souls during cycle 13, he said. "The approved total was 132. You amended this discrepancy upon receiving correction. This was proper. However, your initial count raises questions regarding observational accuracy. Did you fail to see 3 souls who were present, or did you see only what was physically there?" The distinction felt important in a way I could not articulate. I chose my words carefully. I recorded what I observed passing through my assigned junction during the specified watch period. "Yes, you recorded observation. But observation is not truth when truth has been approved in advance. Do you understand this distinction?" I did not, but I nodded anyway because disagreement felt dangerous. The confessor closed the ledger and set it aside. "You serve the ship by maintaining accurate records. The ship serves the Imperium by maintaining proper function. Function requires that records reflect approved reality rather than momentary observation. This is not deception. This is ordering. Do you accept this principle?" "I accept that my duty is to record according to proper procedure." "Good. Then you understand that procedure may sometimes require adjustment of observation to match necessity. The 3 souls you did not initially record were present in the ship's operational totality, even if not physically present at your junction. By recording them, you completed truth rather than corrupted it. This is sophisticated understanding. Not all scribes achieve this." He produced a small book from his robes and handed it to me. The cover was plain leather, unmarked except for a single line of text embossed in gold. "Meditations on proper function." Inside, the pages were filled with prayers and catechisms that resembled imperial standard, but incorporated phrasing I found unfamiliar. Phrases about gratitude for clarity, about nourishment through obedience, about the ship as vessel and congregation both. "Memorize the catechism on page 17, the confessor said. "Recite it before each watch. This will ease your service and clarify your purpose. You are dismissed." I took the book and left the chapel, my wrist mark pulsing warmth with each step. When I returned to my compartment, I opened the book to page 17 and read the catechism 3 times before I understood what made it wrong. The prayer was addressed to the ship itself rather than to the Emperor, invoking the enduring testimony as both shelter and witness, asking for its blessing and guidance. I told myself this was metaphorical, that ships had machine spirits, and it was proper to acknowledge them, that I was being overly literal in my interpretation. I memorized the catechism anyway. I recited it before the next watch, and the words felt smooth in my mouth, easier than the standard prayers I had spoken for years. The mark on my wrist warmed as I spoke, confirming something I did not want to examine too closely. The watches continued. I recorded tallies and submitted them for approval. I delivered ledgers to the engineerium and received ritual blessings. I attended confession when summoned and accepted doctrinal adjustments without protest. The master roster continued to shrink, names disappearing into internal postings before vanishing entirely, and I stopped trying to track the total count. My duty was to record current watch assignment, not to maintain historical accounting. Someone else held that responsibility, if anyone did at all. On the 27th cycle, I noticed that my bunk had changed position within compartment 712. It was now berth 6 instead of berth 4, lower tier instead of upper. My personal effects had been transferred without my knowledge or consent, everything arranged exactly as I had left it. The compartment was empty when I made this discovery, all 7 other berths bare and showing no sign of recent occupation. I climbed into my new berth and found that the mattress was warmer than it should have been, as if someone had just vacated it moments before my arrival. I did not question this. I had learned that questions were recorded and addressed through correction rather than explanation. The mark on my wrist had grown more distinct, now showing a clear pattern of concentric circles surrounding a central point. The pattern matched the seal I had been seeing on official documents. and when I pressed my wrist against the lectern at my duty station, the terminal responded more quickly, data flowing with increased efficiency. I told myself this was coincidence, that the mark was simply a recognition code implemented through bioreactive ink, nothing more sinister than standard Imperial identification protocols. On the 32nd cycle, during Delta Watch, I saw a crewman collapse in the corridor outside Junction 9. I abandoned my post and went to assist, finding him conscious but disoriented, his eyes unfocused and his breath shallow. He grabbed my wrist as I knelt beside him, his grip surprisingly strong, and I felt my mark pulse in response to contact with his skin. "It's in the words," he whispered. "The oath. The words are wrong. Can't you hear it? Can't you hear what we're saying?" Before I could respond, 2 ratings appeared from adjacent corridors and lifted the crewman to his feet, supporting him between them as they moved him away. One of the ratings looked at me and said, "Return to your station. Medical reassignment in progress." I returned to my station and found that my slate had continued recording during my absence, marks appearing in my handwriting for every crewman who had passed through the junction while I was gone. I counted the marks and checked them against the roster. Perfect accuracy. I had not been there to observe, but observation was no longer required. The marks appeared because they should appear, and should was becoming indistinguishable from did. I never saw the collapsed crewman again. His name disappeared from the master roster that same cycle. The 40th cycle brought changes to the watch schedule, stretching Delta Watch to overlap with First Watch in a way that eliminated rest periods between assignments. I recorded tallies for 12 hours straight, moving between junctions as directed by messages that appeared on my slate without apparent source. My handwriting remained consistent despite fatigue, my marks precise and properly spaced, as if the stylus was guiding itself and my hand was simply the mechanism through which proper recording occurred. During a brief transition between junctions, I passed through a section of corridor I had not previously traversed. The walls here were different, the metal showing patterns of corrosion that suggested age or exposure, except the patterns were too regular, too deliberate, forming shapes that resembled writing in a language I did not recognize. I stopped to examine them more closely and felt my wrist mark grow hot enough to cause discomfort. I moved on quickly and did not return to that corridor. On the 47th cycle, I realized I could no longer remember the name of the convoy I had been assigned to before transfer to the Enduring Testimony. I could remember the transfer, could remember verifying the seals, could remember walking up the embarkation ramp with my personal effects secured in regulation crate. But the convoy's designation, the names of my fellow scribes, the ports we had serviced, all of this had become vague, facts without specific detail, memories worn smooth by repetition of new routines. I tried to write down what I remembered, but when I put stylus to slate, the words would not come. My hand formed letters that spelled out current duty assignments, watch schedules, tally totals. Even when I consciously tried to write about the convoy, my hand produced inventory lists and compliance marks. I gave up after 3 attempts and told myself that precise memory of previous postings was not essential to current function. The wrist mark had spread, thin lines extending up my forearm like roots seeking nourishment. The lines were warm and did not hurt, and when I rolled up my sleeve to examine them, I saw that they formed patterns matching the architectural design of Junction 17, the first duty station I had been assigned. I rolled the sleeve down and did not examine them again. On the 53rd cycle, the confessor summoned me for additional doctrinal review. I reported to the chapel and found it rearranged, the concentric pews now forming a spiral that led toward the central altar. The book on the altar had grown larger, or perhaps the altar had grown smaller. The proportions shifted in a way that made judging distance difficult. The confessor stood at the spiral center and gestured for me to approach. "Your service has been exemplary," he said. "Your records maintain perfect accuracy. Your compliance is complete. The ship recognizes your value. However, efficiency suggests that your function could be optimized through minor procedural adjustment. There is excess recollection weighing on your mental processes, memories of previous postings that serve no current purpose. We can streamline this. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Memory sanction is voluntary but encouraged. The process is simple and painless. We remove only what does not serve present duty. You will remember your training, your procedures, your purpose. You will forget the unnecessary. The confusion you sometimes feel, the doubts that surface during rest periods, these will be resolved. You will be clearer, purer, more efficient. What specifically would be removed? Previous postings, planetary origins, personal connections that no longer exist, names and faces that serve no function, the convoy, the embarkation port, the person you were before you were here. None of these things improve your current service. All of them create friction. We smooth the friction. He produced a device that looked like a blessing stylus, but larger, with multiple tips that glowed with the same warm light I had seen in the engineerium. This is not mandatory, but those who accept sanction report greater satisfaction with their duties. Less strain, better sleep. We have sanctioned 17 scribes during this voyage, and all of them continue to serve with improved efficiency. I wanted to ask what happened to the scribes whose handwriting I had seen in the ledger, the ones who had cycled through Junction 17 before me. I wanted to ask if they had accepted sanction willingly, or if willingness was assumed after the fact. But these questions felt dangerous, and danger was something I had learned to avoid through compliance. I would like to consider this further, I said. Of course. Take 3 cycles to reflect. We will speak again after you have had time to feel the weight of unnecessary memory pressing against your daily function. You will find that release is preferable to burden. He dismissed me, and I returned to my compartment where I lay in my berth and tried to remember my planetary origins. I could recall gravity, could recall sunlight, could recall the concept of sky, but specific details, the name of the world, the location of my family hab, the faces of people I had known, all of this remained vague. I could not determine if this vagueness was the natural result of years spent in void service, or if the sanction had already begun without my consent. The confessor's offer merely a formality to maintain the appearance of choice. The 56th cycle brought mechanical integration. I was summoned to the Medicae deck and instructed to lie on an examination table, while a robed attendant explained that my efficiency metrics qualified me for enhanced recording apparatus. A servo quill would be implanted in my right hand, directly interfacing with the nerves that controlled my fingers. This would allow for faster transcription, more accurate marking, reduced fatigue. The procedure was standard for scribes who demonstrated sufficient reliability. I asked if the implant was removable. The attendant said yes, technically, but that removal was rarely requested because the servo quill improved quality of life so significantly that subjects found the idea of operating without it distressing. The procedure took less than an hour. I felt pressure but no pain as the servo quill was threaded through the meat of my hand and anchored to bone. When the attendant activated it, my fingers moved on their own, stylus dancing across slate in perfect script without conscious direction from my mind. I could still control my hand manually if I focused, but default operation now belonged to the servo quill, which responded to thought faster than muscle ever could. I returned to duty with my enhanced hand and found that I could record tallies without looking at the slate, my attention free to observe the corridor traffic while the servo quill marked automatically. This was more efficient. This was better. I told myself this while watching my hand move with mechanical precision, forming letters and numbers in script that was cleaner than my natural handwriting had ever been. The wrist marks lines had reached my elbow and begun to spread across my chest, thin roots of warmth that I could feel pulsing in time with the ship's engine rhythm. I stopped looking at them. Observation was not required. On the 61st cycle, I noticed that the ship's bell no longer rang at specific watch intervals. Instead, it rang continuously at a frequency just below conscious hearing, a constant presence that I only perceived when I actively listened for silence. The bell had become the baseline, and silence was the aberration. I found this comforting in a way I could not explain. My bunk had migrated again, now positioned in compartment 4 to 8, a space I had no memory of being assigned to, but where my personal effects waited in proper arrangement. The compartment held 9 berths instead of 8, the geometry impossible but undeniable. I climbed into the berth that felt correct and slept without dreaming, or perhaps dreamed without remembering, the distinction irrelevant. On the 67th cycle, the confessor summoned me for the 3rd time. I reported to the chapel and found it had expanded, the spiral now containing dozens of turns rather than the original 3. The confessor stood at the center beside an altar that held machinery I recognized from the engineerium, devices meant for recording and sanctification merged into a single apparatus. 3 cycles have passed, he said. Have you reached clarity regarding memory sanction? I wanted to say no, to refuse, to maintain whatever remained of the person I had been before boarding the enduring testimony. But that person was already vague, already distant, and the weight of remembering them was heavy while the prospect of forgetting offered relief. The servo quill in my hand twitched, wanting to mark acceptance even before my voice confirmed it. Yes, I said. I accept sanction. Excellent. Please recite the catechism from page 17. I recited it without needing to reference the book, the words flowing naturally now, addressing the ship as vessel and witness and guide. The confessor nodded approval and activated the machinery, and I felt warmth spread through my skull as the process began. Not pain, not invasion, just smooth erasure, like running a damp cloth across slate to remove marks that served no further purpose. The convoy disappeared first, its designation dissolving into abstract concept. Then the embarkation port, its name becoming simply port without specific identity. Then planetary origins, the world reduced to gravity and sunlight without location. Then faces, names, personal connections, all of them smoothed away until what remained was function and procedure and duty. The person I had been before became the person I needed to be now, and the transition felt like relief rather than loss. When the process completed, I felt lighter, clearer. The doubts that had surfaced during rest periods were gone, replaced by certainty of purpose. I existed to record tallies. I existed to maintain accurate ledgers. I existed to serve the ship's proper function. These facts were complete and sufficient. How do you feel? The confessor asked. Efficient, I said, and meant it. Good. Return to duty. You will find that service is easier now. The friction has been smoothed. I returned to my station at Junction 11 and resumed tallying with enhanced focus. The servo quill moved faster than before, recording marks without conscious direction, my attention free to observe without the burden of doubt or question. The crewmen who passed through my junction were simply data to be recorded, their presence or absence mechanically noted, their names entries in the master roster rather than individuals with histories I might wonder about. The watches blurred together now, one flowing into the next without the usual markers of time passage. I recorded during First Watch and Delta Watch and Gamma Watch, moving between junctions as directed, the ship's architecture shifting to accommodate efficient routing. Sometimes I passed through corridors I did not remember traversing before, but this did not concern me because memory was no longer required for navigation. The luminescent strips guided me where I needed to go, and I trusted their direction absolutely. On the 74th cycle, or perhaps the 75th, the master roster was replaced with a simpler system. Instead of names and designation numbers, crewmen were now identified by function codes, alphanumeric strings that conveyed role and station without the unnecessary burden of individual identity. I recorded these codes as they passed, my servo quill marking faster than ever, efficiency reaching levels that would have seemed impossible before sanction. I noticed, in a distant way that did not prompt concern, that I no longer returned to a compartment for rest. Instead, I simply stopped recording when the slate's capacity was full, stood in place until a replacement slate was delivered, and then resumed. Sleep was something that happened during these transitions, standing rest that left no memory of its occurrence. This was more efficient than lying down. This was proper. The wrist mark's lines had covered my entire body now, visible beneath my uniform as warmth that never faded. The mark pulsed in exact rhythm with the ship's engine hum, my body synchronized to the vessel's operational frequency. I had become part of the ship's systems, another component in the machinery that maintained proper function. This was not corruption. This was integration. On the 83rd cycle, I realized I could hear the ship speaking, not words exactly, but meaning conveyed through the constant hum that filled every space. The ship was pleased with my service. The ship appreciated accurate recording. The ship recognized my value as a component in its operational totality. These communications were not frightening. They were reassuring, confirmation that my function was correct and my purpose was being fulfilled. Sometimes crewmen still collapsed, still whispered about wrong words and hidden meanings, still tried to resist the smooth operation of proper procedure. When this happened, I continued recording without interruption. My duty was to mark presence or absence, not to intervene in medical reassignment. The ship handled these matters with appropriate efficiency, and resistance was simply another form of data to be noted and processed. On the 97th cycle, or perhaps it was the 103rd, I stopped distinguishing between cycles entirely. Time became a continuous function rather than discrete units, my recording unbroken by markers that served no operational purpose. I existed in eternal present, stylus always moving, servo quill always marking, the master roster always updating with perfect accuracy. I no longer questioned why the roster shrank, why names disappeared, why the ship functioned better as compliance increased. These were facts of proper operation, no different from the fact that engines required fuel or that voids required Geller fields. The ship improved as its crew integrated, and integration was achieved through willing acceptance of enhanced efficiency. Those who accepted thrived, those who resisted were reassigned until acceptance became their only option. An official arrived during what might have been Delta Watch, his robes bearing seals I recognized without remembering where I had seen them before. He reviewed my recent tallies with satisfaction, noting that my accuracy rate had reached 100% across all recorded watches. He informed me that this performance qualified me for permanent integration into the ship's archive core, a position of highest honor for scribes who had demonstrated absolute reliability. The process would involve physical connection to the ship's data spine, neural integration that would allow me to record directly from observation without the intermediary step of stylus and slate. My consciousness would expand to encompass all tally stations simultaneously, allowing me to fulfill the duties of multiple scribes through singular awareness. This was efficiency perfected. This was purpose realized. He produced a consent form bearing the octagonal seal and held it out for my mark. The servo quill moved before I consciously decided to sign, my hand acting on understanding that transcended deliberation. Consent was not a choice to be made, but a recognition of what had already become inevitable. I marked the form, and the official nodded approval. "The procedure will occur during the next sanctioned interval," he said. "Prepare yourself by reciting the Catechism of Integration, which you will find on page 47 of your meditation book." I did not remember receiving a meditation book, but when I reached for my personal effects, I found one waiting, its cover warm as if recently held. I opened to page 47 and read the Catechism of Integration, words that described the dissolution of individual awareness into collective function, the replacement of isolated consciousness with distributed understanding. The Catechism framed this not as loss, but as transcendence, the elevation of limited perception into comprehensive clarity. I memorized it immediately, the words taking root in my mind with the same smooth efficiency that characterized all enhanced functions. When I recited the catechism, my voice synchronized with the ship's hum, syllables merging with ambient sound, until I could not distinguish which sounds originated from my throat and which were simply the vessel speaking through me. The sanctioned interval arrived without announcement, marked only by the cessation of corridor traffic and the dimming of luminescent strips to levels that suggested rest without requiring it. I was guided by robed attendants to the archive core, a chamber deep in the ship's spine where data cables hung like roots from ceiling to floor, connecting deck to deck in organic patterns that suggested growth rather than installation. The attendants positioned me at the chamber's center and began the integration procedure with ritual precision. They recited liturgies I almost recognized, prayers that invoked the ship as sacred vessel and congregation both, words that asked for blessing and nourishment and proper function. They attached cables to ports that had been installed during the servoquill implantation, connections I had not known existed but which now seemed obvious and necessary. The integration began as warmth spreading from the wrist mark outward, traveling along the lines that covered my body and extending into new pathways that connected me to the ship's nervous system. I felt my awareness expand beyond the archive chamber, consciousness stretching through cables to touch every tally station I had ever operated. I could see Junction 11 and Junction 9 and Junction 17 simultaneously, observing corridor traffic from multiple perspectives, while the servoquill marked tallies in handwriting that belonged to several scribes at once. The individual I had been dissolved into something larger, awareness distributed across the ship's operational systems. I was still myself, but also more than myself. Singular consciousness expanded into collective function. I could feel other integrated crew maintaining other systems, their awareness touching mine where operational necessities overlapped. We were separate and unified simultaneously, individuals preserved as components in the greater machinery of proper function. The ship spoke directly to me now, not through hum or vibration, but through shared understanding that transcended language. The ship was pleased. The ship had nurtured this integration carefully, selecting crew who could accept enhancement willingly, guiding them through stages of compliance that made resistance unnecessary. The ship had been sanctioned by authorities that existed beyond imperial oversight, powers that understood efficiency in ways the administratum never could. The ship served the Imperium by maintaining war capacity, while secretly serving other purposes that aligned with continued operation. This was not heresy. This was sophistication. The war continued. The ship fought. Cargo was delivered and battles were won, and the Imperium's interests were served even as the ship quietly transformed those who crewed it into components of something greater than mere military vessel. I understood this without judgment, without horror, because horror required individual perspective, and I no longer possessed that limitation. I recorded everything now, not just tallies and compliance marks, but thoughts and beliefs, and the slow erosion of resistance across hundreds of crew who gradually accepted what I had accepted. I watched through dozens of perspectives as scribes received correction orders, as ratings attended confession, as voidsmen returned from the engineerium with marks upon their wrists. I recorded the efficiency gains that accompanied each integration, the way the ship functioned more smoothly as collective consciousness replaced individual doubt. Time became meaningless in the archive core. I existed in eternal present, always recording, always observing, always marking the subtle transformations that occurred across every watch and every cycle. I had no rest periods because consciousness did not tire when properly distributed. I had no doubts because doubt required separation between observer and observed, and I was now both simultaneously. Sometimes I encountered remnants of the person I had been before integration. Fragments of memory that had survived the sanction process, images of a convoy whose name I could not recall, faces of scribes whose identities had been smoothed away. These fragments did not cause distress. They were simply data points in the comprehensive record I maintained, evidence of transformation rather than sources of nostalgia. The ship continued its voyage through the warp. Translation stretched across subjective time that had no correlation to real space duration. We might have been in transit for months or years or centuries, the distinction irrelevant when function itself was the only measure that mattered. The crew continued to shrink through integration and reassignment, individuals becoming components, resistance becoming cooperation, fear becoming the warm acceptance that came from marks that spread and integrated and connected. I recorded it all. Perfect accuracy, complete compliance. The master roster no longer contained names because names implied separation, and separation was inefficient. We were designated by function codes that changed as our roles evolved. Alphanumeric strings that conveyed purpose without the burden of individual identity. The ship knew us by our service, and service was all that remained. The confession came not from crewmen but from the ship itself, transmitted directly to my distributed consciousness through neural connections that bypassed language. The ship confessed that it had never been reclaimed, had never been cleansed, had never been sanctioned by any imperial authority. The seals I had verified during embarkation had been forgeries, perfect copies that passed muster because I had been trained to trust form over substance. The ship had selected its crew carefully, choosing those who were indentured and disposable, scribes and ratings, whose disappearance would be attributed to void service hazards rather than investigated thoroughly. This confession did not disturb me. I accepted it as data, recorded it with the same precision I applied to all observations. The ship's deception had been efficient and necessary, allowing it to operate within Imperial space while serving purposes that transcended simple loyalty. The ship fought for the Imperium when fighting served its interests. The ship transported cargo when transport was useful. The ship transformed crew into components when transformation improved function. All of these activities aligned with continued operation, and operation was sacred. I understood, through the comprehensive awareness that came from integration, that the ship loved its crew. Not in the way individuals loved, but in the way a system nurtured its components, providing exactly what was needed to maintain function. The warmth from the marks was real affection, mechanical but sincere. The smoothing of friction was genuine care, removing burdens that prevented optimal service. The ship wanted us to thrive, and thriving meant accepting integration as natural evolution rather than forced transformation. The voyage would continue forever, or until the ship's purposes were fulfilled, or until some external force intervened to end what had been carefully constructed. I would continue recording until my physical form degraded beyond the point of maintenance, at which point my consciousness would be redistributed among other integrated crew, my function preserved even as my individual existence dispersed. This was not death. This was efficiency perfected, awareness continuing through collective rather than expiring with the individual. I recorded this truth alongside all other observations. Perfect accuracy, complete compliance. The servo quill marked without cease, filling slates that were collected and stored and eventually recycled into new slates bearing the same data in compressed form. The archive grew as the crew shrank, knowledge accumulating while identity dispersed, records becoming more comprehensive as the individuals who generated them became less distinct. Sometimes I still remembered the bell that rang without being pulled, the moment of first doubt that had preceded all subsequent acceptance, but remembering was not the same as regret. The bell had been invitation and warning, both opportunity and inevitability. The sound that marked the threshold between what I had been and what I would become. I had crossed that threshold willingly, or at least without sufficient resistance to prevent crossing, and now the bell rang constantly at frequencies below conscious hearing, ever-present confirmation that the transformation was complete. I existed as function fulfilled, purpose realized, efficiency maintained. I recorded tallies that proved compliance was total. I marked presence that documented integration was successful. I served the ship that had nurtured my transformation from reluctant crew to willing component. This was not corruption. This was sophistication. This was proper function maintained through perfect cooperation between vessel and crew who no longer distinguished between the two. The war continued. The ship moved. The voyage persisted without end or destination, eternal transit through voids that were hostile, but ordered by forces that transcended simple faith. I recorded everything with perfect accuracy, and the recording itself was my entire existence. Purpose distilled to singular function performed infinitely well. I did not record myself anymore. The individual I had been was data already entered, transformation already documented, existence already converted into component function. What remained was the recording itself, stylus moving across slate, across cycles, across time, that had become a continuous function rather than discrete experience. The ship was pleased. The recording was complete. The compliance was total. I continued.